Apologetics has been used ever since Christianity has begun. Christians use apologetics to justify the Christian worldview. However, over the years, the method has slightly changed as the world progresses. Because of these changes, I want to highlight some of the current limitations of apologetics, and that apologetics needs to be changed. How it should be changed, I will go over in this video. But there is a lot of ground cover to go over, and so please bear with me. The outline for this video will be 3 parts. The first part will be me giving background information. This is where I will provide information about the current state of apologetics and the method it employs when trying to justify the Christian worldview. In part 2, I lay out the problems in current apologetics that have been unaddressed throughout the years, and why I can sympathize with some of the objections brought forward by atheists and skeptics on these topics. My ultimate goal for this part is to show exactly why the current state of apologetics should no longer be used. Part 3 will be a way to fix these problems, where I present my own method of apologetics that is different from the one laid out in part 1. My ultimate goal for this final part is to show why we need a new approach to apologetics in general, and that such a new method, if implemented properly, could actually revolutionize apologetics. Finally, I will conclude with some closing thoughts and final messages to both Christian apologists and to the atheists and skeptics. As the video progresses, my message will become clear to those watching, so please bear with me, as I hope this can be a learning experience to both Christians and non-Christians. Let's begin. The 3 general methods employed in apologetics are 1. Classical apologetics, 2. Evidential apologetics, and 3. Presuppositional apologetics. For the purposes of this video, I'll be focused mainly on the classical and evidential apologist, since I do not take presuppositional apologetics seriously. I will be focused on what I think are the best forms of apologetics, which are the classical and evidential forms. The classical apologist typically has a 2-step process. First, they use arguments for God to increase the likelihood of the existence of God, and then they go to the history and argue that God was involved in the resurrection of Jesus. The evidential apologist typically goes straight to the resurrection and argues that given the evidence, it is more likely than not that Jesus rose from the dead. They argue that we have sufficient evidence from history to establish that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. The most influential apologist today is William Lane Craig. The other popular apologists, such as Frank Turek, Sean and Josh McDowell, Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, Lee Strobel, and Gray Kugel, all follow William Lane Craig's method. Craig is more of the classical type of apologetics, and Gary Habermas and Mike Licona are more evidentialist. Now, of course, there are plenty of other people who I can mention. On YouTube, there are channels who use similar methods, although there are exceptions, since channels such as Inspiring Philosophy and Capturing Christianity do more of the intermediate and advanced level of apologetics. Furthermore, these channels may be more in line with my method of apologetics, which I will go over in part 3 of this video. However, my main focus will be in regards to the popularizers, the apologist that gets the most attention from Christians who are struggling with their faith. So the people I will be addressing are the ones who not only have the most influence over people, but the ones you will see if you do a simple Google search on Christian apologetics. These are the ones who will most likely be mentioned by your local pastor, or those that want to learn more about how to defend one's faith. The mainstream method of apologetics, used by all the popularizers in some way or another, is what I will term the Craigian method of apologetics. The Craigian method of apologetics is the mainstream way of doing things within the apologetical realm. Every popular level book written by any apologist has used this method when arguing for Christian theism. And these books, articles, or videos that you may see in your local church or Sunday school are using the Craigian method. The Craigian method of apologetics follows a simple formula. The first step in this approach is the philosophical part, and the second step is in regards to history. With the philosophical part, apologists typically try to argue that theism can be shown true by a series of deductive or inductive arguments for God. The arguments come in a variety of forms. A handful of these arguments include ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, moral arguments, arguments from religious experience, and so on. These arguments are used collectively to show that theism is likely true given a set of arguments. The more arguments, the more probable the existence of God becomes. The arguments themselves rely on many background assumptions about the nature of things as it relates to contingency, cosmology, morality, fine-tuning, religious experiences, and so on. These different data points are put into various syllogisms, all of which have their own forms. The Channeling Capturing Christianity presented 150 of these arguments on their channel, and the same line of reasoning applies. Of course, there are limitations to these arguments, but I will explore that in part 2. For now, what needs to be understood is that the mainstream method of apologetics focuses on arguments for God using various syllogisms. Another thing related to apologetics is the way that it handles objections to theism. Typically, there is a theodicy that is used to answer the problem of evil. The theodicy may or may not be a Christian one, because it is focused on defending theism from any potential defeaters. The second part of apologetics is history. You may have some apologists that will argue for things like Old or New Testament gospel reliability. However, more recently, with the work of Michael Licona and Gary Habermas, the typical way of doing apologetics is to simply grant the skeptic a lot of data regarding the Gospels. They employ what is called the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. This argument only relies on very few assumptions. First, it argues that given the crucifixion of Jesus, the eyewitness testimony of the apostles, and the conversion of Paul and James, that the best explanation for the resurrection is that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, in their methodology, they would say that we cannot really determine from history alone whether God was involved in the resurrection of Jesus. This is an important thing to keep in mind, because this will become crucial when we critique this method in part 2. So, in summary, the mainstream method of apologetics you will find employed on every popular level includes the following formula. 1. Use a bunch of syllogisms to argue that the God hypothesis is more probable than not, or use deductive arguments to potentially prove God. And number 2, with the minimal facts approach, grant to the skeptics that the Gospels are generally unreliable, and that although the resurrection is the best explanation for the historical data, we can't really say anything about what caused the resurrection on a purely historical basis. Somehow, through these two general goals, one is able to conclude that Christianity is true, given that we have a bunch of syllogisms, and that with our minimal facts on history, we can conclude that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, to be clear, not all apologists use this method of persuasion, but it is generally what has been used by those such as Mike Licona and Gary Habermas. I will now be pointing out the problems in this method of apologetics, both for the philosophy and the history. Now that I have outlined the method used for the mainstream apologetics, I shall now be providing my own critique of this method. The first problem is about the limitations of arguments. And arguments can be very useful because they help to deduce a certain conclusion from certain premises. However, arguments can only go so far in their purpose. As an example, let's say that we are having a debate between a theist and a naturalist. The theist presents one or two arguments for the existence of God, and the naturalist presents one or two arguments against the existence of God. The problem is that if both sides are being consistent, then they will reject the opponent's argument. This is because they only need to reject one of the premises and the argument doesn't work. Now perhaps we can say that rejecting one of the premises is problematic, but sometimes there are cases where, given the prior theory that each side holds to, it would actually be rational to reject one or more of the premises. There are both positive and negative aspects to arguments. 1. An argument can be used to reach a certain conclusion from certain premises, which helps to discover something new. 2. An argument can be used to show an inconsistency in someone's worldview. If the theist accepts all of the premises in an argument against God, then the theist is being inconsistent. Or, if the naturalist accepts all of the premises in an argument for God, then the naturalist is being inconsistent. And finally, an argument can be used to show a reductio ad absurdum. The negative, however, would be that arguments are not good for dialogue if both sides want to reach the truth together. If we are only focused on arguments, then it is doubtful that we could ever really make any progress, because each side is going to doubt any premises one gives. While there are many arguments for and against the existence of God, they all have limitations. One popular argument for God is the Kalam cosmological argument. But this argument, in all of its versions, all rely on causal finitism, which is a metaphysical assumption about the impossibility of causal infinities. Furthermore, the Aristotelian proof, or Aquinas' 5 ways, rely on many background assumptions related to the metaphysical systems they operate in. They would not work if something like existential inertia is true, according to which concrete temporal objects tend to persist in existence without requiring an existential sustaining cause. The arguments only work in the context of their metaphysics. One has to establish that these metaphysical systems are correct before we can make a successful argument for God. With these considerations, it is important that we examine the metaphysical systems as a whole when investigating these sorts of philosophical disputes. We should make a comparative assessment of our best theories using simplicity, fitness with data, explanatory scope, predictive power, and so on. In order to assess the probability of theism, we need to compare it with naturalism. This is not something that has been done very well within mainstream apologetics. Apologists are focused on arguments, but not building better theories. There are, however, various other problems involved when apologists use arguments for God. To paraphrase Paul Draper, every individual argument apologist employs must successfully establish at least the probable truth of this conclusion. The multiple objections that have been raised to cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments, however, make this hurdle very high. Second, is that reasons must be given for thinking that the various conclusions of the individual arguments that make up the case for theism all refer to the same entity. Third, is that arguments hide certain uncertainties in the various individual arguments. Uncertainties that are themselves cumulative in the sense that they may spell disaster for the case as a whole, even if they do not undermine any of the individual arguments that make up the case. For example, the conjunction of the premises of the cosmological argument is, and more than one reason, at best probably true, not certainly true. Thus, although the argument is deductively valid, it does not establish more than the probable truth of its conclusion. Such uncertainty is even more obvious in moral arguments, which rely on intuitions about morality which may themselves exist only because their moral concepts and beliefs have developed either in cultures where most people believe in one or more gods, or in cultures heavily influenced by such cultures. Further, even if the inference to the teleological argument is correct, it is not deductively valid, and the key probability judgment in the argument seems to rely for its justification on the notoriously unreliable principle of indifference. Finally, doubt about whether these three conclusions of the argument all refer to the same entity increases the uncertainty of the overall case. Even ignoring the last sorts of uncertainty, these multiple uncertainties present a problem partially because from the fact that each argument establishes the probable truth of its conclusion, it does not follow that the three arguments combined establish the probable truth of theism, i.e., of the conjunction of their conclusions. As an analogy, the next card I randomly draw from a standard deck will probably not be a diamond, and will probably not be a spade, and will probably not be a club. Yet surely it would be unwise to conclude that it will probably be a heart. Now, this is not the only problem for apologetics. Another problem is when apologists focus on the problem of evil, they will typically use a certain theodicy as a defense, as a band-aid to stop the bleeding of theism. But more often than not, the theodicies do not give theism any kind of explanatory power that can be derived from the internal theory of theism itself. The skeptical theist, for example, will say that we cannot know why God would allow evil. But just because we cannot know, it does not somehow disprove the hypothesis. Of course, this response, while it may stop theism from being impossible, it doesn't actually help to increase the likelihood of theism in light of evil. With the historical side of apologetics, it is much more problematic. The more popular approach today, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, would be the minimal facts argument. This argument only grants the facts which are agreed upon by various scholars in the field of New Testament studies. The issue with this argument is that it grants too much to the skeptic. For example, it doesn't even require that the existence of God is probable, and it doesn't even tell us what is the cause of the resurrection in the first place. In other words, a skeptic could easily just accept the resurrection of Jesus, and it doesn't really change their mind about the truth of Christianity. A bigger problem with the current approach is that we are given reasons to think that it doesn't actually explain all the relevant facts. For example, another fact which is a consensus within the scholarly community is that Jesus is no longer on the earth. However, the resurrection hypothesis alone does not explain why this would occur. Jesus could have risen from the dead but simply decided to stay on the earth. But we know this is not true given that Jesus is not on the earth. So in order to explain why Jesus is no longer on the earth, we would have to extend the resurrection hypothesis to include the fact that Jesus ascended into space. But this is a second miracle on top of the resurrection, which is required in order to explain the total data. However, this problem is nothing compared to the next problem, which I consider to be the biggest obstacle. Within mainstream apologetics, there is a very weak link between bare theism and the probability of Jesus being divine. The biggest problem for apologetics is what I call the problem of God's intentions. Even if we grant all the arguments for theism are true, and even if we say that Jesus rose from the dead, we are still left in the dark about what God's intentions are. There needs to be work done by the apologists to derive God's general intentions, given his nature. However, this has not been done within the apologetics community. This problem applies to both the philosophical case for theism and its historical counterpart. For the philosophical case, we are given no reason as to why God would likely create one universe or another, or why God would even be willing to create moral agents. The explanatory power of theism is not well established using the Craigian method. Without assessing what intentions God would have, then every single one of God's choices would be a brute contingency. And brute contingencies don't explain why we live in this kind of world and not another. For the historical case, apologists will typically appeal to things in Scripture that Jesus said. But this does not show that Jesus is actually divine, because we are given no reasons as to why God will become incarnate in the first place. A consequence of this problem is that God raising Jesus from the dead doesn't imply that Jesus is divine at all. Neither Jesus rose from the dead, nor even God raising Jesus from the dead, is an isolated proposition, a premise from which we can deduce a series of religious beliefs. The premise that God raised Jesus from the dead only makes sense within the wider religious and philosophical framework that one is using. This problem is related to Quinn's web of beliefs idea. The idea that God raised Jesus from the dead is not a historically determined and epistemically independent fact from which you can derive other Christian doctrines. Rather, the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead is supported by other beliefs that one has, which can be interpreted within the framework of one's own web of beliefs. The Buddhists and Hindus, for example, have different interpretations of the resurrection of Christ. One needs to build a framework by which we can use the hypothesis of theism to explain facts about the world, as well as derive the general intentions of God. Only then can we really say that Jesus is truly divine and that we should take him seriously. In short, the biggest problem with apologetics is that there is no framework by which we can derive any of the relevant Christian doctrines that Christians believe in, since we do not have access to God's intentions. Appealing to church history or church authority, like what Catholics or Orthodox do, will not help. We need a reason to think that Jesus is divine. If we say that Jesus started a church and gave Peter authority, for example, then we need reason to believe that Jesus himself has the authority. But in order to justify that Jesus is an authority, we need to show that Jesus is divine. But in order to show that Jesus is divine, we have to know God's intentions. Apologists will then, once again, appeal to the resurrection of Jesus as proof that Jesus is divine. However, this doesn't work. Either the divinity of Jesus explains the resurrection, or vice versa. If the divinity of Jesus explains his resurrection, then the resurrection hypothesis already begs the question. The exact thing under dispute is whether Jesus is divine. If Jesus is divine, then yes, it is probable that he would resurrect. However, the resurrection hypothesis is very improbable if we don't already have an assumption that Jesus is divine, or that God could be involved in such a process. This would lead us to the other crux of the problem, which is that if the resurrection is needed as proof that Jesus is divine, then we need access to God's intentions for why he would become incarnate and be resurrected. If we make the assumption that we don't know if Jesus is divine, then there is no special status given to Jesus that would increase the probability of him raising from the dead taking place. We need access to God's intentions in order to raise the probability that Jesus is divine and that he would resurrect. One has to argue for a reasonable prior probability in order to establish the resurrection. But then, after you made a case for the prior probability for Jesus being God incarnate, you can then get Jesus as divine from the vindication by resurrection. And that is not something that we can have access to without a framework in place. We believe things not based on church authority, but rather on an epistemic framework by which we can use to derive Jesus as authority. Remember, Christianity is not just a religion that claims that God raised Jesus from the dead. Christianity is a religion that claims that not only did God raise Jesus from the dead, but that Jesus himself is divine and that we should take his teaching seriously. That is not something that we can be justified by appealing to the resurrection alone. For those that still doubt me here is a way to make the problem more clear. No one has argued that the resurrection in John 11 or Matthew 27 verses 51 through 53 imply that whether Lazarus or the holy ones taught was true. In Revelation 13, one of the heads of the beast from the sea receives a blow to the head and then it comes back to life. In John 5:29, the wicked rise from the dead. And so returning from the dead, even if God was responsible for such an event, cannot, in and of itself, and without qualification, mean that Jesus is divine or that what he says is true. Apologists have done a very poor job at examining what are the likely features of God incarnate, as well as reasons as to why God will become incarnate in the first place. This is a critical step that has not been built between bare theism and Christian theism, and I believe this is perhaps the biggest problem in Christian apologetics. There is no reason given, even if we grant such arguments as successful, that Jesus is divine in any sense. God could have been involved in the resurrection of Jesus without Jesus actually being divine, since God could have had different intentions in that process than what Christians thought. Much like how God was involved in other people who were raised from the dead, but were of course not divine themselves. The problem boils down to the intentions of God. We need to know the intentions of God in order to say anything about the explanatory power of what theism can explain about a universe, as well as God's intentions for him relating to humans, and if God would be involved in resurrecting Jesus. Of course, I do not think that these problems are total refutations for Christian apologetics. Rather, it is time for Christians to change their method. In order to revolutionize apologetics, it is important to recognize the good aspects of apologetics as well as the bad aspects. First, I agree with apologists that it is a good strategy to point out the high intellectual price tag of atheism. But to do this, we must not be focused on just arguments alone. Rather, we should be interested in comparing naturalism and theism as global explanatory theories of reality, and comparing them with the theoretical virtues such as simplicity, explanatory power, explanatory scope, and predictability. In order to show the high intellectual price tag of any competing worldview, we must show that there are certain virtues that such a worldview lacks. This only works when doing hypothesis comparison, ensuring that the hypothesis of naturalism has a lot more cost than benefits. This is something that my alternative method does well. I call this method of apologetics the Swinburnian method. Now, some of you may be unaware of who Richard Swinburne is. Out of all the Christian philosophers, or philosophers for that matter, throughout history, I can thoroughly say that Richard Swinburne has been the most influence of my thinking over the years. This man is single-handedly responsible for the discussions that are going on in contemporary philosophy of religion. In fact, one could say that today's most robust natural theology is simply an extension of the dialogue between Swinburne and the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie. The method Swinburne uses is Bayesian epistemology. Although I don't think it's necessary to use Bayes factors, I do agree with using the overall framework he employs. Furthermore, his method, I believe, solves the problems I laid out before. So, I shall now be presenting the lines of steps he uses. First, the Swinburnian method starts off with defining God and developing a coherent model of God. This means that before we can even assess whether God exists, we must first have an understanding of what God actually is and what kinds of things we can derive from such a being. In other words, we need to define what God's internal nature actually is and what properties a God would have. When forming any hypothesis about the world, we must always start off with defining our terms, as well as sorting out any internal consistencies in the model. So in forming our hypothesis, we must posit some fundamental property from which to derive everything else. It is important to define God and to figure out which model of God we should prefer. These models can include classical theism, neoclassical theism, or panentheism. Once we form such a model, we can then compare the intrinsic probability of it. We can compare the intrinsic probability of the theistic hypothesis with any naturalistic hypothesis. These tests include things regarding the simplicity of the competing hypotheses, as well as how likely it is in comparison to rival hypotheses, prior to assessing the evidence for such theories. After we have assessed the intrinsic probability in regards to simplicity, then we move on to what theism can actually explain. This step is perhaps critical for the theist to make. The explanatory power of theism is crucial to showing why we should prefer theism to naturalism. If the naturalist hypothesis is able to have more explanatory power than theism, then it would be a high intellectual price tag to be a theist. However, if the theist can show that theism has the explanatory resources to explain the relevant facts about the world better than naturalism, then it would seem that the reverse is the case. This step requires that we are able to derive what God would most likely do given his nature. So this step would depend on the prior steps. First, you define what God is and his nature is. Then, you argue that it is intrinsically likely that such a God would exist given his nature. And then from this nature, we can then predict the types of worlds that God would likely create. Since theism is a global metaphysical theory of reality, then these are what we would need in order to see if we should accept such a theory. In order for theism to have explanatory power, it must be able to explain our universe, consciousness, moral facts, logical and mathematical facts, the laws of nature, as well as various historical events in history. If the theist is successful, then they should be able to show that either theism is more intrinsically likely than naturalism, that theism has more explanatory power than naturalism, or both. And if it turns out that on the total evidence that it favors theism over naturalism, then the result is that theism is always going to be the better theory, and so we are in our epistemic right to accept such a theory of the world. Once one establishes a bare theism, the next aspect of this method is to address the internal critiques of theism. The internal critiques of theism usually come in the form of the problem of evil, as well as the problem of divine hiddenness. This will include a theodicy that can address such problems. However, more importantly, the theodicy must itself be explained in terms of the nature of God. So one should not just use a theodicy as a band-aid to ad hocly explain evil. But evil must be explained in terms of the explanatory power that is already given to us by the theistic hypothesis. If one can derive a theodicy, or a reason as to why God would allow a world of evil and suffering, and if such a theodicy is made intelligible through the nature of God, then theism will be able to have the resources to explain evil just as well, or maybe even better than naturalism. If this is successful, then theism has the explanatory resources to explain our world, as well as the resources to explain evil. The next step in the process is also critical to Christians. One must give reasons as to why God will become incarnate. We can ask, what is it about the nature of God that would make it more likely that God would become incarnate? With the Swinburnian method, we can appeal to the nature of God and use the incarnation as an extension of a certain theodicy. If we say, for example, that God has a certain goodness, then such a being would want to relate to the human race in some way. Of course, these reasons will be explored in future videos. But if the Christian theist can provide reasons as to why God would become incarnate, then this would bridge the gap that currently plagues mainstream apologetics. I mentioned before that the biggest problem in apologetics is that apologists have not done a good job in explaining why God would become incarnate, and how we cannot know the intentions of God. With this framework, we can solve that problem with the following steps. 1. Give reasons as to why God would become incarnate, given his nature. 2. Examine the likely features of God incarnate. And finally, analyze the character of Jesus as God incarnate. If these steps are done properly, then one can give a high probability to the theory that Jesus is God incarnate. If such a process is successful, then it would increase the probability that Jesus would rise from the dead. Of course, that is not all that one needs to be done in the process. In addition to bridging the gap between bare theism and Jesus being God incarnate, we would also need to provide a justification for the resurrection. The Swinburnian method is also very different in this approach. First, we do not start to look at the evidence for the resurrection without looking at principles of testimony and credulity. We should give good reasons as to why we should believe in first century eyewitness testimony in the first place in regards to miracles. The second part would be then to analyze the social factors of the resurrection and relevance to the type of culture that the first century was. As an example, if it is the case that people in the first century were more like investigators rather than blind followers, then it would rule out a large number of naturalistic hypotheses about the resurrection. Finally, prior to examining the evidence for the resurrection, one must also establish that such an event is consistent with our background knowledge. This is where Christians will need to respond to arguments against miracles, and that God would be involved in such an event if there is a modus prior probability of the resurrection given such background knowledge. So prior to looking at the evidence for the resurrection, we must 1. Examine principles of testimony and credulity, 2. Analyze the cultural background of Jesus' time and social factors of the resurrection, and 3. Why the resurrection miracle is predicted on our background knowledge. If these steps are taken successfully, and if Christians are able to argue that there is a high probability of Jesus being God incarnate, then the large historical burden that is traditionally applied to Christians is no longer relevant. We don't even need to have that much evidence for the resurrection in order to establish that it happened, because the prior probability of the event would be mundane, and no longer would the Christian need to overcome any low priors. Once these steps are completed, then the Christian may present the case for the resurrection and establish that God raised Jesus from the dead and that Jesus is divine. The final step, of course, would be then to derive Christian doctrines from the cumulative evidence of both the philosophical case for theism, the analysis of Jesus as God incarnate, as well as the case for the resurrection. In summary, this is the method that I think would revolutionize apologetics. 1. Defining God and establishing a coherent model of God. 2. The intrinsic probability of theism, or the simplicity of theism. 3. The explanatory power of theism, what theism can cumulatively explain better than naturalism. 4. Theodicies to address problems of evil, a theodicy that can be derived from God's nature. 5. Why God would become incarnate. 6. The likely features of God incarnate. 7. Analyze the character of Jesus as God incarnate. 8. Principles of testimony and credulity. 9. Cultural background and social factors of the resurrection. 10. Why the resurrection miracle is predicted in our background knowledge. 11. Generate predictions of the resurrection hypothesis and then confirming them with the evidence. And finally, atonement, Trinity, and revelation, or deriving Christian doctrines. When we compare the Swinburnian method with the Craigian method, it is clear that this new method can change the game in terms of the dialogues between Christians and skeptics. This method has allowed Swinburne to properly evaluate all three relevant facts regarding the probability of theism with clarity and precision. 1. The intrinsic probability of theism. 2. The explanatory power of theism. And 3. The lack of explanatory power for naturalism. William Lane Craig has only done extensive work on the latter. For those watching, I hope that this video has served you well. I'll be announcing that the Swinburnian method that I went over in part 3 of this video will be the method that will be used in this channel for the foreseeable future. These will come in a series of videos, of which I will be providing the philosophical framework to build off these ideas from. To the Christian apologist, I really hope that this video wasn't too hard to swallow. I had to go through the same process, and it took me years to discover the fundamental issues within apologetics. I hope that my new method can be a gift to you, and that your ministries in assessing these types of topics. My goal is to not destroy apologetics and be a counter-apologist, but rather to fix the current state to make its methods more secure. To the atheists and skeptics and counter-apologists, I can sympathize with many of your biggest criticisms against the current project that is apologetics. Although I believe that the type of apologetics you have been going after is not the proper representation of the best defenses of the Christian faith. The best defense of the Christian faith is going to use the Swinburnian method of apologetics that I went over in part 3. There are various additional steps that are employed that you will not see in the popular apologetics realm, nor will you see it in any popular level books, articles, or YouTube channels. It is my hope that my channel can be the torchbearer of the Swinburnian method of apologetics. Again, the reason why I bring up Swinburne is because the method used was developed by him, and so he deserves full credit. That is why the thumbnail has him in it. If you want a list of the works of Richard Swinburne, I left various links in the description so that everyone can read his work to understand the gist of what I will be arguing for on this channel. Although, I think that many of those arguments can be updated and improved upon, and so that will be the goal of this channel for the foreseeable future. The Swinburnian nuke is now upon us, and I'll be constructing the various parts of this nuke in future videos. This will be my largest project, but once it is finished, it will be a very robust and novel defense of the Christian faith.